story of number 333, a semi-detached house in Sheffield, South Yorkshire, is the story of William C. Grave, the man who bought the property in the mid-2000s and was then witness to some of the most intriguing, frightening, paranormal events on record. William went on to write a book about his experiences called The Lady in the Bay Window, a true story of a haunted Sheffield home, and the incidents, as far as anyone knows, continue there to this day. In 2004, William was still only 19 years old and lived with his parents in the family home in Sheffield, which allowed him to live a more than comfortable life. He earned good money as a salesperson at a local car dealership, which helped him to build up his savings. Despite this easy lifestyle, he and his girlfriend decided to look for a house of their own, and towards the end of the year, they actively began to look for properties for sale. They eventually found one, a typical semi-detached house in the south of the city near Sharnock, and they quickly arranged a viewing. William was really eager to see the property, so decided to drive to it the day before the viewing, just to have a look around the outside. He described the house as a semi-detached property situated quite high up from the roadside, with bricks that looked dark and weather-worn. There were also 2 bay windows, one above the other, that overlooked the front garden, which was very overgrown. Generally speaking, though, William came away from this outside viewing very impressed. By the time he and his girlfriend had viewed the house from the inside, they were ready to put in an offer to the seller, an offer that was quickly accepted, although it would be several weeks before the pair could pick up the keys. Around a week or so later, on a cold December night, while on his way to a Christmas works night out, he decided to drive past his newly bought property with his friend Craig. The pair remained in the car. Craig leaned out of the window to get a better view of the house. He agreed it looked like a lovely place, before going on to ask, "Who is the old lady in the bay window?" William stared at the house, looking at both bay windows, unable to see anyone in any of them. He asked his friend what he meant, to which Craig pointed up towards the top bay window, insisting, "There in the top window, the old lady staring down at us." William looked up at the house once more, still unable to see anyone standing at any of the windows. At this point, he double-checked with Craig that he was looking at the correct house, elaborating that his property was number 333. But Craig remained quite insistent that he had the right house, and he was certain somebody was standing at the window, saying, "She's looking at us now. You must be able to see her." Despite staring up at the house for several moments, William was unable to see anyone looking at them from the windows. After an awkward moment, Craig simply shrugged his shoulders, and the pair set off to the Christmas bowling night. On the way, though, unable to forget Craig's claims, William asked him what the old lady had looked like. He responded by saying she was quite a small old lady, maybe in her 80s, and was wearing a dark-coloured cardigan over a white blouse. He went on to say that she had short grey curly hair and quite a piercing stare, and that she didn't look happy with us parking outside of her house. Despite his seriousness, William eventually convinced himself that Craig had been joking around and no one had been standing at the window. The incident, though, would prove to be the first of many in this normal semi-detached house. Around a week or so later, on December the 18th, 2004, William and his girlfriend finally got the keys to their new home. At this point, all William knew about the house was that the previous owner had purchased the property for his mother, but she hadn't taken to it and wanted to move out after only 2 months. He didn't question why this elderly lady had rushed out of the house. However, when he walked to his new home for the first time as the official owner, before he could open the front door, he heard voices coming from inside. He opened the door and stepped in, immediately finding himself looking at a large bald-headed man who held out his hand to shake William, saying he was the previous owner, Nick. Nick apologised for still being at the property, stating that he had returned to get a bag of tools he had left there. A moment later, an elderly lady entered the room. She introduced herself as Nick's mum and stated that she had lived in the property around 6 months ago after Nick had purchased it at a property auction. She then went on to say that the house had only one previous owner, an old lady who had had the house from new in the 1930s when it was a council house. She had, however, passed away, leading the property to be put up for auction. The old lady then went on to state that something in the house just wasn't right. Before William could ask the lady to elaborate, Nick interrupted their conversation, and before he knew it, both of them were gone, leaving William alone. Despite this strange conversation with the previous owner of the property, he still didn't put two and two together. Instead, he put the conversation out of his mind. To begin with, while waiting for their carpets to be fitted, William's girlfriend remained living with her parents, meaning William would be alone in the house for several days. With this in mind, he invited several of his friends over for an unofficial housewarming party to celebrate his first night in the new house. 5 friends arrived, each bringing some beers and sleeping bags. They decided to sleep in the living room, but before turning in for the night, they enjoyed a few drinks and played board games. However, a couple of hours into the evening, one of William's friends, Greg, suddenly screamed in panic before running out of the room, knocking drinks over in the process. He eventually stopped running when he was right out of the room and at the far end of the hallway. When the rest of the men in the room looked at Greg, he was simply staring at a small Christmas tree that William had set up earlier. The room was full of shouting from the other men, annoyed that Greg had not only spilt their drinks, but also ruined the game of Monopoly they had spent hours playing. Greg simply stood there, staring at the Christmas tree. Whatever it was, William could see his friend was truly terrified over something. When the rest of the men returned to chatting amongst themselves, William took Greg into the kitchen. After he had calmed down a little bit, Greg asked William, "Did you not see her? An old lady sitting on an invisible chair next to the Christmas tree. She was just staring at me, hovering on nothing." With Greg saying that to him, William's mind went back to his friend Craig's claim of someone standing at the bay window when he took him to see the house that night. William asked Greg to describe the old lady. His friend responded that she was probably in her 80s or 90s with short curly grey hair. She was wearing a long skirt and white blouse. She also wore a dark-coloured cardigan. She was staring right at him. This description made William's blood run cold. He decided not to tell Greg what Craig had seen and how both descriptions of the old lady matched up. He eventually convinced Greg to stay, and they returned to the living room. Although there were no further incidents that evening, William later said he was glad he wasn't home alone that evening. With Christmas over, it was now 2005, and William's girlfriend had moved in with him. He was more than relieved that he had witnessed no further strange events. He did, however, learn more about the house's original owner from the man who lived next door but one to him. His name was Tessa. According to Tessa, the lady had lived in the property since it was a council house in the 1930s. It was well known that the lady, Mrs. Tompkins, had taken great pride in her home. Specifically, it seemed, in ensuring her windows were always sparkling clean. Although Tessa himself hadn't seen anything strange since she had passed away several years ago, William was now for the first time beginning to wonder if the person his friend Craig and Greg had seen was Mrs. Tompkins. By the summer of 2005, William was living alone at the house after he and his girlfriend had split up. Given that he was completely alone and had 2 spare bedrooms, he decided to look for a lodger or two from among his friends. One of them was Doug, who William had known since they were children and had always got on well with. Doug would take the second largest bedroom that overlooked the rear garden. It was as they agreed on the terms of the room that William asked Doug if he might know anyone who would be interested in renting the third smaller room at the front of the house. Doug did indeed know someone. and several hours later he introduced William to Dan. As soon as he saw the room, despite its size, Dan was very keen to move in. To begin with, William didn't mention anything about the strange events to his new lodgers. However, they got on so well that one evening, after several beers, he told them about the bizarre experiences when he first bought the property. To his surprise, both of them were more than interested, with Doug eventually asking William if he had looked in the loft to see if there was anything spooky up there. William realised he had not yet ventured into the loft, and although it was 10 p.m, the three men agreed to go and investigate. Once upstairs, William and Dan lifted Doug up towards the loft. Once he had his head through the doorway, he took out his mobile phone and used it as a torch so he could look around. A moment later, he suddenly jolted in fright and dropped the phone and somehow wriggled out of his friend's grasp and fell to the landing floor. He took a minute to come to his senses before telling William and Dan that the loft was empty, all except for a single wooden stool in the middle of the room, something which, for reasons he couldn't explain, had immediately unnerved him. However, after taking a few minutes to calm down, Doug went back into the loft, where he sat on the stool and recorded several minutes of footage on his phone. Following this, the three friends returned to the living room, discussing why someone had left a single wooden stool in the loft. Incidentally, although they didn't spot anything out of the ordinary in the video footage Doug had captured in the loft, when a mutual friend of the housemates watched it several weeks later, they claimed to see several strange orbs of light moving around the loft. Orbs, the friend explained, were often signs of a spirit presence manifesting. These strange events would continue sporadically for the next few years, with the three housemates regularly hearing heavy footsteps coming from various parts of the house, as well as occasionally seeing a shadowy figure out of the corner of their eyes. William later said that just about everyone who came to the house during this time witnessed some kind of paranormal activity. During these years, William found himself working 70 to 80 hours a week, and as such would spend the weekends letting off steam with Doug and Dan, usually drinking and ordering takeaway food. One particular weekend, however, was stranger than most. It was a Saturday and there was a big football game on between Manchester United and Manchester City, which was being shown on the TV. The kick-off was at 5:30 p.m, and the three housemates, as well as two other friends, Ben and Brad, had several drinks at the house during the afternoon while they waited for the kick-off. A third friend, who had the nickname Bungle because, according to his friends, resembled a character from a children's TV show called Rainbow, also joined them later in the evening. As all six friends were watching the game and chatting loudly, something strange changed the entire evening. William and two of the others were sitting on the settee in front of the TV when suddenly, out of nowhere, the settee lifted into the air on William's side, almost as if a pair of invisible hands had hoisted it up. After several minutes, whatever force was holding it released it, and it crashed back to the living room floor. All six of the men were stunned into silence. The only sound in the room was coming from the football match on the TV. After a moment, William blurted out, "What the hell was that?" Speaking up from the other side of the room, Brad nervously said that he had seen what had happened, elaborating that the settee suddenly lifted a good 5 inches into the air at one end, then fell back to the floor. In fact, so unsettled by what he had seen, Brad excused himself and left the house to go home. Although the other friends remained at the house, the atmosphere was now far from happy. William said whatever was going on at number 333, it wasn't normal. Although it wasn't related to the strange activity in the house, by early 2008, Doug and Dan had both moved out, meaning William was living alone at the property once more. This also meant that he was paying all the bills by himself, something that was beginning to put a strain on his finances. By pure chance, his brother Darren had recently gotten engaged. He and his girlfriend were living in a small flat behind their parents' house. Darren asked William if he could move temporarily to their flat and they live at number 333 until after the wedding, after which they would have their own property to move into and he could move back. Of course, this also meant a break from paying the bills and the upkeep of the house for several months. So William agreed. During their time at the house, Darren and his girlfriend witnessed much of the same paranormal activity as William and his housemates had over the previous years. It was now winter 2008, and Darren and his girlfriend had married and were living in their own house. William had moved back to number 333, and as soon as he walked through the door for the first time, he could immediately tell that something didn't feel right. He said that there seemed to be a presence in the room with him, and although this presence was undoubtedly the same as had always been there, this time it felt stronger than ever. It was so strong that he almost had the feeling someone was physically standing right beside him. It's at this point that I should mention that several months previously, Dan had tragically died. Now, confronted with his heavy presence in the house, William spoke out loud, saying, "I can feel you are here with me. Is that Dan or some other spirit in the house?" Not getting any kind of response, he then reached for his phone and took a picture of the space directly in front of him, again stating out loud that if someone was there, they should show themselves. He then turned slightly. He was now facing the television, which was switched off, and took another photo. A moment later, he viewed the two photos. When he looked at the second one, he was stunned at what he was looking at. He began looking at his reflection that he had accidentally captured on the TV screen. He began to zoom in more and more until finally the image on the screen became clear. There, standing over him, was a dark, shadowy figure. He was now certain this presence was not Dan. His friend had been slim and around 6 feet in height. This figure was much taller and towered over him as he sat on the sofa. He further stated that the figure was just a black mass, and while he couldn't see or make out any finer details, it was definitely a bulky-looking man. Now, in complete shock, William rushed out of the house and made his way to his parents' home, where he stayed for several hours. Some weeks later, William lost his phone at a house party, and along with it the photo, which is most unfortunate, not only for William, but also for the researchers who are looking into the case. A few months later, in the summer of 2009, William had found 2 new housemates. Paul had agreed to rent the larger room, while Matt rented the smaller one that overlooked the front of the house. It was during this time that Darren often arrived at the house on a Sunday afternoon to sleep off the large amount of drinks he'd had in the pub. He would often stay the night, returning home the following morning. One Sunday, though, stood out from the others. After he had arrived from his usual Sunday session, Darren, along with William, Paul and Matt, was sitting in the living room watching TV. Suddenly, Matt blurted out for William to pause the TV. He did so and then turned to face Matt, who was staring at a small gap below the living room door, under which a ray of light was visible. William asked Matt what he was looking at, to which he replied that he had just seen a shadow move slowly past the bottom of the door. William kept the TV on pause, and a moment later all 4 of the men heard footsteps coming from outside the living room. William said that the footsteps sounded like a heavy-footed person with boots on, who was walking slowly away from them in the direction of the staircase. They then proceeded to go up the stairs, becoming a little less audible with each step. If there was any doubt as to the direction the footsteps were headed, it was removed when the loose floorboard at the top of the stairs creaked loudly as if someone or something had stepped on it as they made their way to the bathroom. Then, even more surreal, they heard the handle of the bathroom being turned, followed by the squeak of the hinges as it was pushed open. The footsteps then stopped, and there was a few moments of silence. This was then harshly broken by the sound of the bathroom door slamming shut before the silence returned once more. That was part 1 of William's terrifying story. In part 2, things get even worse. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.